This is Gleb Tsipursky, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
Yes, indeed. Gleb Tsipursky is with us. He's the author of now 6 books. Today, we're concentrating on the one that called our attention, which is called Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. The other 6 books, though, there were 4 others. There's a brand new one called The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. That sounds like a great topic that we will get to perhaps in the next episode. However, hot on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, you have yet another book that's going to come out on an accelerated schedule, and it will be out by the end of this month. Is that correct?
By the end of May, that's right. It's called Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Because I stomped on you there.
No worries. Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic.
So you have authored this book in the time span of the weeks since we have been on lockdown.
It's kind of crazy. So my publisher, obviously I published a number of books. So my publisher, who knows me well and knows that my expertise is in disaster avoidance, risk management, and decision-making, he saw a number of interviews I did about the kind of bad decision-making we make around the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, and we can talk about that. But businesses, individuals, everyone has made some really terrible decisions. So I did a number of interviews and a number of articles for Business Insider, Inc. magazine, places like this, entrepreneur.com, interviews. So then he approached me and said, hey, would you like to write a book about this topic on a super accelerated timeline? And I'm like, yeah, this is an important message that should go out there. So sure, I'll do it. And then we originally had a timeline of June, and then he moved it up on me to mid-May. And so I was writing like crazy for this period at the same time as I was helping my clients manage their disaster avoidance and business continuity plans. So it was a really stressful time for the last 6 weeks, and got especially stressful when my dad got sick with what's very likely COVID-19. He's 79, he lives in New York City. He started having really bad coughing and shortness of breath, and it was really tough for a while. He's feeling better right now, but that did not help. That really brought down my mood in that period of time.
Well, I'm glad he's feeling better. That's the priority in this all, but also amazed that you're able to get that content together for everybody to benefit from. And that's a crazy amount of acceleration for the book cycle. How long is it typically for you to create from an idea a book that gets published? What's the cycle?
The usual cycle to create an idea to create a book from an idea is about 2.5 years. Now, once the book is accepted by a publisher, the usual cycle so it takes about maybe 6 months to a year until a book is accepted by a publisher, because you have to write a book proposal, and then you have to go get an agent, and then get an agent. Well, I have an agent, but get an agent to get a deal with a publisher, and then sign the deal, right? You have to negotiate things, sign a deal. That takes about 6 months to a year. And then it takes about maybe 6 to 9 months to write the book, edit it, get it to the stage where it can be published. And then maybe another 6 to 9 months, maybe a year, depending on the book cycle, to get it published. So usually it takes about 18 to 24 months from the point when the deal is inked with the publisher for it to go out. And in this case, it took something like 2 months, and my publisher was also working like crazy to get the proofreading, all the stages compressed into a very narrow cycle after I finished it. So that it was a very stressful period, and I'm glad it's done.
I wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about the book Never Go With Your Gut that we're here to talk about today, and also throw a little shout out to the guys over at, I got to get their name right here, at Actions and Limit Podcast, Justin and Paul, because they covered a lot of the ground with this COVID stuff. So encourage people to go listen to that episode, and we'll probably come and touch on it just because it's so relevant. But the question I wanted to lead off from my end of it with is this: when you went to name your website, your brand, I mean, obviously we're always trying to figure these things out. Did you you nailed it? Disasteravoidanceexperts.com. And look where you landed here today. Oops, this is disaster has been completely redefined now that we have a worldwide pandemic.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where it's the unfortunate consequence for me of being more on target than most people in terms of, growth experts, whatever. I've always been doing disasters. This is my expertise, disaster avoidance. I've been doing that my whole career for over 20 years, doing consulting, coaching, and training, and 15 years in academia, studying this as a cognitive neuroscientist, behavioral economist, because disasters result from two things: either bad decisions that we make ourselves, so the decisions that we as human beings make that lead to disasters, or decisions that we fail to make. So decisions that are a consequence of us failing to make the right decisions leading to disasters. And there are so many bad decisions that people fail to make or made about COVID-19. There are a number of countries which have done wonderfully. So South Korea, for example, had no shutdown, and it had the cases in South Korea were discovered on January 20th, the same day that they were discovered in the US. But South Korea has something like 12,000 cases or so, and definitely under 1,000 deaths. So this is great, by comparison to the kind of response that happened in the US. Terrible decision making by a number of people, which we can talk about. But yes, it's definitely, unfortunately, very much something that calls for my expertise to be in demand.
When it comes to the comparison between their success with flattening the curve and our lack of success here in the U.S., of course, we have to account for proportion of population. But what do you attribute to how much of it was decision making? How much of it was better planning in the first place on their part?
It's overwhelmingly decision making. So when you see the kind of response that South Korea engaged in, you can see that the US had pretty good resources, pretty good planning resources, and there were a number of countries in the Western world which actually responded really well. So Germany, by example, it responded really well. It's a highly developed country, very diverse, very complex, in many ways similar to the US in that regard. So very big, very diverse, very complex, but it only has something like 7,000 deaths by comparison to the US, which has had over 65,000 deaths by now, and of course, many less cases. And the COVID-19 spread in Germany at around the same time as it spread in the US. This is an example of where you could see the kind of responses that Germany took. They did really great contact tracing and testing, whereas the US did very incompetent and is still doing pretty incompetent testing. It's doing pretty much no contact tracing to speak of. And as a result, we have to shut down the whole economy. Many states have shut down the whole states. Other states have shut down partially and are trying to open back up, and some of them are doing it very badly and incompetently in such a way that it will result in a spike of cases. So we're seeing that decision-making made right here in the US is leading to very bad outcomes. It's unfortunate and it's tragic, but it's true. People are making very bad decisions. A number of business leaders are making very bad decisions. And this all comes from how our brains are wired. We are not wired to make good decisions in the modern world. And that's the problem. People trust their decision-making too much. In Germany, there's much more humility around the kind of decision-making that people take place, and there's much more listening to experts, to expertise. Whereas in the US, people have much more confidence about their own decision-making, much less trust in experts. And that, in situations where you actually should trust experts, leads to terrible decision-making. Like I said, we are not wired to make good decision-making in the modern world because our gut reactions, our intuitions, our feelings are actually wired for the savannah environment, not today's world. So when we listen to our gut, when we trust our feelings, it's great for in-the-moment, instinctive, intense responses, what you might have heard of as the fight or flight response. When you have saber-toothed tigers and you need to flee from them, jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger, also called the saber-toothed tiger response. That's great for intense in-the-moment threats, but it's terrible for slow-moving, high-impact, low-probability train wrecks like the pandemic.
Let me jump in here and ask you a couple of questions. One, so disasters seem to come in three basic varieties, and feel free to correct me because that's why I'm asking. There's the ones you make, the ones that you have to respond to, and then the combination of the two together. When we look at something like COVID and decision making, we have two different examples that are very similar in terms of deaths. Utah, which has about 3.1-ish million people, Orange County, where I live, 3.1-ish million people. Both have just over 50, but not 60 deaths. Dramatically different densities and dramatically different responses. Utah's remained fairly open. So their external environment is just really tough, and it's a Are you a quant guy with your PhD? Are you a methods guy?
I use some. I'm a social scientist, so I use some statistics, some evaluation. I don't go super deep into the data and look at patterns. That's not my expertise. I look at decision making.
Yeah, so what do you make of that compare and contrast, where you have two Western areas that are dramatically different in size and density, dramatically different in response, but have the same basic outcome? Is that external environment, or is that good decision making? What do you make? How do you make sense of that?
You make sense of it by looking at the kind of conditions they faced. So if you have both of them going through a similar situation and similar conditions, then yes. But from what I recall, California was much more vulnerable to COVID-19. So it started much earlier there, spread much quicker there, partially because of the larger Asian population there and connections to Asia, to China, and so on. Whereas Utah, of course, has many less connections to China. So it's less vulnerable. It's less influenced and impacted by COVID-19. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in Utah. We don't know what's going to happen in California, but I'm strongly suspect that if you find that Utah remains open when there's going to be more possibilities for infection. So let's say, Salt Lake City is a high density area, right? So if you go to Salt Lake City and people start spreading infections and Utah chooses to remain open, then it'll be really bad. Whereas Orange County, California, it has more safety precautions for what happens if there are going to be more spreaders. So that's something that's beneficial, and they know more about how to shut down effectively. So that's kind of something you want to be thinking about. Now, where you are, the right policy for any area is going to be dependent on the local dynamics. But the thing is about local dynamics that we fail to think long-term about the dynamics. So here's the thing about COVID-19. When you have one person with COVID-19, that person, if there's no suppression, if it's open like Utah, there's no serious suppression efforts, that person usually infects 2 to 3 other people on average. So every person infects 2 to 3 other people. And so the pandemic outbreak grows at a rate of about 3 to 6. Every 3 to 6 days, the pandemic doubles. And then about 3 weeks after somebody becomes infected, probably something like 10% of the people who are infected need hospital treatment. So it grows very quickly. And then hospitals have a serious threat of becoming overwhelmed if you don't look 3 weeks out and see what's actually needed for the hospital systems. So you need to impose various social distancing, suppression measures before hospitals become overwhelmed. Otherwise, you get into the same situation that happened in New York City, where many more people died than should have died with appropriate treatment. So that's the appropriate approach to any situation for any area in general. And until we have a vaccine, and we won't really have a vaccine available, mass-produced, distributed, the earliest possible time that we can have it is the beginning of 2022. And that's if everything lines up really well. So we're in a very bad situation especially if a government doesn't take the steps necessary to control the pandemic, and if a business doesn't so I focus a lot on business, right? That's my expertise. An organization, nonprofit, doesn't take the steps necessary to control the pandemic within its own ranks and staff.
So let me push you a little bit on this.
Sure.
I have the luxury of knowing these numbers and having it at me. We actually just had Dr. Will Riley on the show, who's a political scientist, and he looked into the lack of evidence in support of shutting down. Like, there's just no empirical evidence that supports it. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing. It's just the evidence isn't there. And we can reference his paper another time. But if we look at Sacramento, which is 400,000 people, Oakland, 400,000 people, and look at the whole county, Alameda County, Sacramento County, again, 45 to 60 deaths. Salt Lake City, which is 200,000 people, the entire county around it, zero deaths. So Is it possible that as we look at this and we look at the empirical data that doesn't necessarily support closing down, that there's really no difference, I guess is what we want to say, is when you're a governor or a mayor and you're trying to take in a lot of expert opinion, how do you sort out conflicting expert opinion? I mean, we had a show recently, this is not on COVID, and I'm not trying to pin you on something. I'm trying
I'm happy to answer. So
we had on a State Department guy, and we had on an intelligence community guy, and we're talking about the Iranian actions with the United States, and they go crosswise, right? They're both right, but they have different goals and purposes. So when you're a leader or you're just a day-to-day person and you've got conflicting expertise, what do you do? What does that German dude do to get that right?
I mean, it's very simple. Whatever the previous person who said that there is no data on suppression being effective, that's simply false. If you look at the data on New York State, which is obviously a hard-hit state, when you instituted suppression, they were able to flatten the curve. Here in Ohio, where I am, Columbus, that's where I'm based, so go Bucks. When they started suppression, they flattened the curve. Flattening the curve means you cut down on the number of cases that were going to be, you cut down on the growth of new cases and bring it down. So that there's extensive data showing that depending on the amount of pandemic, of disease in an area, then the more cases you have, the more suppression you need to make. What is happening in Utah, Salt Lake City, let's say it this way. I don't know how many cases there are right now, but let's say, hypothetically, let's say there are 1,000 cases, right now. Then I'm very confident that in about 4 weeks, you'll have something like, from those 1,000 cases, something like 10 deaths. Because we know that at the current rate of testing in the US, we have a fatality rate of something like 1 to 2%. More realistically, half of the people are asymptomatic, so more likely the fatality is closer to 0.5 to 1%. But people die. Very clearly, people die. And very clearly, when you put in suppression measures, you bring down the growth of the growth of cases. That doesn't mean suppression is the right situation. So let me be very clear. I'm a business consultant. I work with businesses and I focus a lot on what makes economic sense. So what makes economic sense when you look at the trade-offs of lives lost to the pandemic versus health and lives lost to poverty, there's a trade-off to be made. So you don't simply say, suppress everything, shut down everything, and
right.
Everything will be great, because A, how will people make money? And B, people will die anyway if they're not making money. So that's bad. So you want to have a balance. What I suspect is the ideal balance, without having done an extensive study on this in any way, is to have loosening of restrictions until you see that hospitals are going to be, in a month or so, not too far from being overwhelmed. And that's when you impose shutdowns to decrease the growth of new cases, because you don't want to be in the same situation as New York City and as Northern Italy was. So that's likely the best balance of health and of economic benefit. What that means is that some states that are opening up right now, like Georgia, are actually doing it too early in the sense of which ones are opening up. So we probably don't want to be opening up barber shops right now. People can wait a little bit to get their haircut. I just got my Corona cut, right? I got, a kid and I shaved it off, right? So people can wait for barbershops. That's not an emergency, I can tell you that. But opening those up, that creates close proximity. I strongly suspect that there will be a growth of new cases in Georgia. So the growth of cases will increase. The rate of cases will increase. And if they don't shut down more than they are right now, they will face a situation similar to New York, where their hospitals are going to become overwhelmed. And you don't want that, because the death rate shoots up from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%, where all the people who would be hospitalized now die. That's bad.
Yeah.
So that's probably, without having done a study on this, that's probably the best trade-off to make. So this is what we're facing essentially until vaccine. We're facing a situation of loosening restrictions, increase of cases. Then when cases look like in a month or so that they will overwhelm hospitals, because when people get sick right now, they need to go to the hospital in a month. That's kind of the rate of infection. Then that's when you need to have a restriction and people can do less stuff, unfortunately. And then we'll face waves of this. And then of course, there's going to be eventually a loosening of restrictions and tightening of restrictions. We're facing waves of this until we have a vaccine. That's the only solution to the whole problem, having a vaccine. And people don't realize that they think they'll be over by a couple of months, August and so on. The earliest possible that we can have a vaccine, realistically speaking, available for mass use with significant amounts of people vaccinated is going to be by the beginning of 2022. So we're dealing with this for the next 18 months at the least. That's periods of restrictions and loosenings every 3 months. And people are just not prepared for it. They're making really bad decisions. This is what's called the normalcy bias. So the normalcy bias is one of the many dangerous judgment errors that we face, cognitive biases that I describe in my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Wise Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. It causes us to think that the future is going to be normal. It's going to be mostly like today. We'll just go on, everything will be fine. We don't anticipate the kind of major disruptions that result from serious factors outside of our control, like the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis. That was a major disruptor, and people couldn't really imagine it. They kept buying houses. They thought that it wouldn't be a big deal, that it wouldn't be a bad thing. Well, of course, it was really bad. And now the pandemic is a similarly major disruptor. So people can't imagine, it's very hard to imagine viscerally with our gut reactions, with that fight or flight response, that we'll never go back to January 2020. It's just never going to happen. We will never have that life again. Because if we face the most optimistic 2 years of these waves of restrictions and loosenings, people's habits, norms, ways of thinking will be very different. And of course, their businesses will be very different. I mean, the airline industry is not going to do well. The restaurant industry is not going to do well. Barbershops are not going to do well, unfortunately. So this is something that people aren't facing. And this is really hard. This is really hard for people to hear.
Let me jump in here then. So
yeah,
as a leader at the national level, you have to balance all of these things.
Yes.
If you had a crystal ball advisor and they said, look, roughly 3 million people die every year in the United States, and no one's advocating more death for being flippant. So let's just say that as a caveat. But if your advisors came to you and said, whatever the disaster is, this is a new way that people in America are going to die, but the numbers roughly will be within 100,000 people of normal. Should we shut down the entire economy, including barbershops and massage parlors and tennis courts, or president, whomever, right? Just whoever it is, let's not get crazy with anything else. Or should we, find some middle road response, where we do try to be more restrictive in this? Like, obviously, we know that coronavirus is not good when you mix a large crowd on a ship, in a prison, any kind of dorms. It's not going to go well there, but it seems like on a tennis court, you would be okay, because you're outside. It doesn't do well in the heat, that kind of thing. So going to the beach, you already sort of socially distance. Like, no one wants to be 2 feet away from someone else on the beach. That's not what you go to the beach for. So as we look at these things as a leader and you try to balance out what the cost is, it's going to be uncomfortable no matter what you do. But yeah, how do you sort out cross purposes? Because the person from Department of Commerce, the person from HHS, all these different departments all have different goals, and you're trying to make the best decision in real time with the information you have, not the information you might have.
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's funny that you brought up tennis courts. Actually, tennis is my favorite hobby, so that's something I'm really missing out a lot.
I put you on korfball. I thought you were a korfball guy.
No, sorry. Tennis, I love tennis, and anyway, this is something I'm really missing, and it's a hard time for me. I'm really struggling with this information myself, because it's not intuitive for me to envision that the world is really different, and it's hard to see what's going on. In terms of numbers that you brought up, so 100,000 people, that's a large number, but that's not, kind of a catastrophic number. And so if we see what kind of trade-offs, sort of minimal around the edges trade-offs we can make, maybe not have large gatherings and so on, to bring down that number maybe from 100,000 to, I don't know, 50,000, something like that, then those trade-offs would be something that would be worth it. But shutting down the whole economy completely altogether over 100,000 people, I don't think is going to be worth it, because you'll have more pain and suffering that other people will die as a result of shutting down the economy. Now, the problem is when people actually think it's 100,000 people. It's not. That's not what the reality is. So the problem with COVID-19 is that if you let it loose, if you don't shut anything down, about 50 to 60% of Americans will get infected over the course of the pandemic. So pretty quickly, over a few months, that's how many numbers of Americans will get infected. And the hospital system will get overwhelmed. So the death rate will shoot from 0.5% from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%. So now you're getting into really humongously high numbers. So if you thought it was going to be 100,000, it's actually going to be 1 million. But it's not actually going to be 1 million, because the infection rate is going to spread pretty quickly. So much faster than you anticipate. So if you have, of all Americans, let's say 150 million get infected, and then of them, 5% will die. Let's say kind of the lower estimate, the lower bound. So 5% will die. That's going to be 7.5 million. So 7.5 million is a very different number than 100,000. And that is what we want to prevent. So we need to figure out a balance of policies that allows us to have good economic sense, that allows us to go forward and not have some of the shutdowns have been way too restrictive. We don't need to get nearly as restrictive as some of the shutdowns have been. I think beaches, public parks, those shouldn't be shut down. People should have the opportunity to spend time outside. But there are a number of things that should be done if you're in the situation where hospital systems are close to being overwhelmed. So if you're in New York and then you see that people are going to the public parks and crowding way too close together, that may be a time, just in that sort of situation where you see the hospitals are being overwhelmed, to close down parks. But that's kind of an exceptional situation. Most places, if you don't see that the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed, you don't want to shut down public parks. And you don't want to shut down businesses that can still carry out their functions without, let's say, having people in close proximity. So, for example, why not have stores, have pickup? Just have them offer pickup. That's an easy thing to do. You don't need to have them close down. Even non-essential services, non-essential stores, they can do pickup. People can do curbside pickup. That's a pretty easy way to address a lot of problems, for example. So that is an example of where you want to be thinking about going forward. That's the kind of approach I would take. So as the leader of the country, that's the kind of approach you want to be thinking. How do you not result in medical systems being overwhelmed, and how do you still have economic activity that's reasonable?
We got way into detail, as I would imagine is included in your new book, Resilience, but we brought you on to talk about Never Go With Your Gut.
That's right.
How much in Never Go With Your Gut do you talk about our human propensity for being selective with data?
I talk about a lot. So there's a cognitive bias called confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. And we have a lot of other sorts of cognitive biases around, let's say, the self-belief bias, where we let whatever we believe influence our conclusions. And that's a dangerous tendency. So leaders do that all the time. For example, take a look at what's happened with Boeing and the 737 MAX. That's a classical example of confirmation bias and belief bias, where people let their conclusions, leadership let their conclusions about the safety of Boeing airplanes influence their choices. We know from within Boeing internal emails and internal reporting that a lot of people in the Boeing camp were inside the company were saying that this is a dangerous airplane. There's a lot of problems with this airplane. In fact, one email, and I'm directly quoting here, said that this is an airplane designed by monkeys supervised by clowns, and end quote. So this is not something you want to hear about your airplane. And the Boeing executives knew that there were some warnings about the safety of Boeing airplanes, of the 737 MAX, which caused 346 people to be killed and 25 billion to be wiped out from Boeing even before the COVID-19 crisis. However, the leadership just couldn't fathom. They chose to not look at this data and not treat it seriously, not treat it with the attention that it deserves, that their own engineers were warning them that this is a serious issue, because they fell into the bias of, hey, thinking that all of our previous models of Boeing airplanes, 737 MAX airplanes, were safer than past models. So all the past models where, when you have a new one come out, the new one is going to be safer than the previous model. So they just thought that they would follow that same pattern. It's pattern thinking, it's pattern matching. Our brain is great at pattern matching. Unfortunately, sometimes the patterns it finds are the wrong ones, and it selects the patterns that conform to our beliefs as opposed to the ones that go toward reality. And so it looked at that pattern and it ignored the reality. The leaders ignored the reality of the situation, and that's why we have the very serious crisis with Boeing even before the 737 MAX.
When you look at the pattern matching thing, you're right. Like those people on the savannah matched patterns. They figured out where the berries were and they remembered it, and they could, like, hey, there's foamy water in the river. All we got to do is go there and put our clothes in there, and they'll come out cleaner because that was where the soap was. All of these things, they put them together.
Ooh, I've seen these tracks before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we put these patterns together, but we tend to default on we're right, and look, I'm going to take a crack at the ladies here, but they always talk about their intuition, but they don't track their intuition when they're horribly wrong. I mean, we've all been accused of doing something that was absolutely not true by our special someone, especially the ladies. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, that's just not at all what happened. My intuition. But they don't keep a log of the times when they've failed, right? Our confirmation also tends to be that we're right, because it sucks to go, you know what, I'm wrong about this. Mm-hmm. So as a leader, how do you, and you have this great quote, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but comfortable is less than profit. Like, if you're comfortable, you're costing yourself money, and you have to be. I know from my line of work, when I was in the Army and with the Army, my success was built on my errors, and I had to always check myself, because I'm in Afghanistan advising people on extremely complex things, and I am not omnipotent and I'm not perfectly accurate. And so I was always worried about my contribution to the conversation, and I knew that even if I couldn't see it, I was making errors constantly, because you can't get things right reliably in that kind of an environment.
That's right. And this is one of the difficulties of leadership, where leaders who are uplifted and promoted are the ones who show extreme, excessive confidence. Why is that? Well, in the Savannah environment, it was really important for us to support leaders who were the most powerful alpha monkeys in the room. That sort of environment, exactly. That was the confidence conveying leader. And that's the kind of leader you want to follow into battle, and you want to in the heat of the moment. But that's not the kind of leader that we need right now, because you're not following that leader into literal battle, and it's not the heat of the moment. What you're relying on that leader to do is look at the situation calmly and carefully and make a well-considered decision that keeps in mind and keeps them humble. And like you said, like I talk about in the book, where excessive comfort, our desire for comfort, what we feel is comfortable, is often exactly the wrong thing to do. And it's going to cost us a lot of money, because it fits our intuitions, and our intuitions are very often going to get us in trouble. So what we need to do in order to make effective decisions is develop an attitude of humility, and develop an attitude of humility about our confidence. Say that, hey, we likely know much less than we feel we do. We need to be much less confident about the future. We need to acknowledge and accept and come to be comfortable and even love discovering that we are wrong. Because if we develop that positive emotion toward discovering that we're wrong, then we can face reality clearly, and we have an opportunity to be more right in the future, as opposed to rejecting this information and having us fall into a lot of trouble in the future. This is a really hard skill to learn. And what I talk about in the book is, how do you learn these sort of hard skills? This is about becoming mentally fit. Making good decisions is about mental fitness. We practice a lot of physical fitness. We could talk about that, but we don't really practice mental fitness. And mental fitness is developing yourself, developing your discipline. And part of developing your discipline is developing the ability, the positive regard toward learning that you're wrong. This is difficult to do when we don't track our decision making. So one of the techniques I talk about in the book is called probabilistic thinking and experimentation. You want to evaluate your probability of reality. So what do you think is going to happen with this next product launch? Do you think you'll make 100,000 in the next 3 months? Well, great, put it down and let survey all the C-suite leaders and what they think. Maybe one will say we'll make 200,000, another will say we'll make 350,000, another will say we'll have 500,000, and you average it out and you'll say 300,000. Okay, then you go forward and you see how much money the product makes, and if it makes 500,000, then you know who was right in the past, you know who to listen to more, and if it makes 100,000, you also know that as well. So that is the kind of thinking process that you want to be following in order to make better decisions. Predict your probability of reality in the future, what you think the reality should look like. Launch experiments, whether with a small, ideally you'd launch an experiment and not do the whole product launch right away. Do a small launch and see what happens. And then over time, you will be better. You'll make better decisions going forward.
How much do you discuss in the book the practices for mental fitness? Because physical fitness, we all have ideas about how to maintain physical fitness. We're more familiar with that. You have a series of exercises you like to do. You have an idea of the results that they've generated for you in the past. When it comes to mental fitness, for a lot of people, that's a new enough concept, and there aren't mental fitness trainers all over the place at gyms across America. So how much do you discuss this in the book, and are there steps that we can all begin to take to get a sense for how to develop our mental fitness?
Absolutely. So our mental fitness, first of all, let's make sure that we break down the difference between physical fitness and mental fitness. Like you said, people are already aware that there are a number of things you need to do to be physically fit. You need to have a variety of exercises and you need to eat well. And it's very not intuitive for us to do that, because in a savanna environment, we didn't need to exercise. We never really naturally got in our exercises when we were doing hunting, foraging, and gathering. And when we came across our source of sugar, honey, apples, fruits of some sort, it was really important for us to eat as much of it as possible in order to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who had a great fight or flight reflex and who ate all the sugar they came across. While in the modern world, it's a really bad idea to eat all the sugar that we come across, of course. You have a box of dozen donuts. You don't want to eat the dozen donuts, even though—
You've got donuts?
Yeah. I'm not sure I like where you're going.
So that's the kind of thing you want to be careful about, because we are intuitively going to want to eat the whole dozen donuts. That's just what we're wired to do. And we're also wired to make bad decisions. So we are wired to make bad decisions on our physical fitness. Hopefully, many of the people checking out this show have already learned that doing so leads them to a bad situation with their physical fitness, their weight, their health. That's bad. They have not learned that making bad decisions, lack of mental fitness, leads to disasters for their personal life and their professional life. So I talk in the book about both a bunch of techniques to mental habits that you want to build up to have good mental fitness. Just like you build up a whole bunch of habits to have good physical fitness, you need to have good mental habits to have mental fitness. So I talk about probabilistic thinking and decision and experimentation as two of those habits, having a tendency throughout all of your decisions that you don't want to screw up, to have probabilistic thinking, evaluating the likelihood of that something will happen, and launching experiments to see what the information would be. Then I talk about other things that you want to be doing as part of your decision-making process. So you want to do things like considering alternative explanations and options. So you talked about your significant other, right? So let's say that you think your significant other did something wrong. Maybe they left their socks on the floor, right? So then they keep leaving their socks on the floor and you get really upset with them. That is not something that is pleasant for you, and you want to figure out what's going on. and you get upset with them and you get frustrated, and then you have a conversation where you end up yelling and shouting, and that doesn't lead anywhere good. Now, if your significant other tells you that, hey, why'd you leave your socks on the floor again? The right response to that is not, well, why didn't you wash the dishes? That is not the right response.
We've all tried that.
Yes, and it's a very tempting response. With a fight or flight response, that's the fight response. But the right response is to figure out, hey, so you seem bothered by the socks thing. I think we talked about this before, where I'm really tired after I get home from work, and I take off the socks, and then I'll pick them up within the next hour. So is there something bothering you, something on your mind, something different? That is a much more healthy response, right? It's much harder to do it. It's much harder to enact that response. And similarly, think about a business setting. So if you're in a business setting and your boss gives you constructive critical feedback, the temptation is to say either, hey, this is, what's up with this, to have a defensive response or to have an aggressive response. Those are the two tempting things: to have a defensive response or to have an aggressive response, where the defensive response is, to just ignore it, to just say, okay, whatever, I'm not going to listen to this, let it go by. Or the aggressive response is to say, no, you're absolutely wrong, I'm right, you're a jerk, what are you talking about? Neither of those responses is going to be helpful for you in that supervisor situation. The right response, or if you're talking to a client, the right response is to incorporate the information, figure out what's going on, why did the boss tell you that, change your behavior in such a way that you will not get that sort of constructive critical feedback in the future, and improve your performance going forward. That is not intuitive at all. These are complex things. And so that's when you consider alternative explanations and options for your behavior and for their behavior. That helps you get at much better decisions in the future. So that's kind of some of the mental habits and techniques that I talk about in order to develop mental fitness. And I also talk about 5 questions that you want to ask about any decision that you don't want to screw up, and 8 steps for making serious major decisions to make the best decision. And we can talk about that. Those take care of a lot of problems at once, a lot of cognitive biases at once.
When we look at our responses, we have our 3 basic limbic responses within the parasympathetic system. So you have flight, flight or freeze, right?
Right.
So what we're trying to do is trying to build the appropriate response. Like if you freeze because your training, doesn't allow you to go act, you're trying to break that freeze response so you get to that cognitive response. Same thing with fight or flight. Like when that boss attacks you, you don't just come back at them. Maybe you do, but you have to figure these things out. How do you reliably create that? And I want to put an extra piece into this. How do you reliably create that proper cognitive first step, right? So you're stepping in the right direction, not just the limbic response, but then also, there's a lot of philosophies where like you're just going to force your adversary, whether it's your boss, your opposing company, the opposing department, if you just outact them, if you act within their, it's called the OODA loop, you act within their decision cycle, you force them to respond to your actions. So how do you deal with something when the action is purposely being spat at you, or you want to spit, action at your target as often as possible to make it respond and then learn that way? Because that's definitely something that I know a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm. So let's take those step by step. The first is what your response in the situation should be. Your intuitive response is very rarely going to be the right response, unfortunately, especially in professional business settings or in relationship settings, because we're not wired to have the right response for the modern setting. So that natural, primitive, savage response is great for the savanna environment, but it's not civilized. That's the definition of civilization. How do you adapt to the modern environment, right? So being civilized means choosing to respond in such a way that's adaptive to the modern environment and that helps you achieve your goals in this modern environment. So what you want to do is step back from this immediate fight, flight, freeze response, and you want to take a breather. This is where your mom told you, to count to 10. This is actually has been shown by research to be a good habit. So if you count mentally to 10, that gives you time to turn on the more rational part of your mind, the more intentional part of your mind. Now, our mind, according to recent research, is composed approximately, roughly speaking, of 2 thinking systems. One is the older system. It's also called the lizard brain. You might have heard of it as that. It's the autopilot system. It's the instinctive emotional system. Turns on in milliseconds, allows us to jump out of the way of a moving bus. Great for that. Not great for when you're dealing with your supervisor or your significant other. The other system that you want to use in that sort of situation is called the intentional system. That's the more logical, reasoning, abstract system. It can model situations. It can see, hey, what will happen beyond my next comment. It can figure out patterns effectively and can notice where our usual pattern recognition is going to steer us in the wrong direction. That's the intentional system. That's what you want to be using when you don't want to screw up. So you want to take some time, count to 10, go figure out, give time for that system to turn on. It takes a second or two to turn on, and then, of course, to figure out how you want to respond. Now, what you want to do in any situation where you don't want to screw up and you don't want to make a conflict worse, which generally don't, is to try to get yourself toward empathy and curiosity. So try to figure out what are the feelings of that other person that they are acting in a subpar way. Why is that person acting in a problematic manner or a manner that you perceive as problematic? Because your initial story about how that person is going to be acting, you're generally going to, if you perceive them as acting in a problematic manner, you will generally ascribe hostile intentions to them. Whereas it might be a complete misunderstanding. If you thought that your boss is upset at you for an email you wrote, the boss might have misread the email, or the client might have misread the email, or something might have happened. It happens all the time, right? Miscommunication cause for so many problems, but people attribute that to hostile intent, and then they get into conflicts that you can't resolve, which is bad. So you want to step back from that and figure out, what is the person feeling who I'm looking at, who I'm engaging with? What mood are they in? Because our emotions, what the research on the stuff, and I talk about, people are surprised when I talk about emotions because, called rational, logical, right? No. Our emotions determine 80 to 90% of our behavior, our thought patterns, our beliefs. So you want to be very aware of your emotions and the other person's emotions. The awareness of your own emotions is called emotional intelligence, being aware and being able to manage your emotions. The awareness of other people and being able to influence them is called social intelligence. So you want to have both emotional intelligence of yourself, self-management, self-awareness, and in social intelligence, awareness of others and ability to influence them. So in that sort of situation where, going back, when somebody makes a comment that you perceive as negative, try to figure out their emotions and see what's going on with them that caused them to make that comment. And if you can't figure out, try to use curiosity, like I used with the comment about your significant other who's upset about the socks. Try to use curiosity to figure out their emotions, what's going on with them, what's bothering them. Curiosity usually inspires the other person to get into a mode of curiosity, and especially a caring curiosity where you show caring concern with what's going on. Don't be sarcastic. Don't be, what's wrong with you, you jerk? That is not the curiosity we're looking for. You might be thinking that, but don't say it. So that is not the curiosity we're looking for. You're looking for, hey, you seem upset. Help me understand what's going on. This seems like a concerning issue for you. That's the kind of curiosity we're going for, empathetic curiosity. And that will help you address a lot of problems and address a lot of misunderstandings before they start.
Everybody, our guest today is Gleb Tsipursky. His book that we are discussing, his book among several of the books that he's written, the one we're discussing today is Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. We've talked about some of the more complex decisions that leaders are faced with and how to process and absorb information to make those decisions. And it sounds now like we've sort of shifted into more day-to-day dealings that are the small decisions that can pile up. How much of the book balances between the two concepts? How much of this is a daily use practices book?
It has both. So it talks about daily use and major decisions. So I talk about everything from leadership development strategies and how you develop those for your whole company to how do you make decisions about the kind of furniture that you have in order to frame the environment in such a way as to get your clients to buy products as opposed to be concerned about the quality of your business. So and of course, all sorts of relationships between people. Now, for the daily techniques, I talk about technique. that a lot of people have to make a lot of decisions every day, right? I talk about a technique that you can use for any decision, daily decision, that you don't want to screw up, that you want to make sure does not go wrong. This is asking 5 questions about any decision that you don't want to screw up. It applies to any sort of daily decision. Let's say you're writing an email to an important client and you don't want to screw that up. So asking these 5 questions about that, as well as any other decision, will help you avoid disaster. So first question, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't you take into account? Let's say you're writing an email to get your client to take the next step in a project which is going to be complex and burdensome for them. Maybe you haven't taken into consideration why your client might not do that. It's very tempting for us to ignore information that goes against our intuitions, against our preferences. So we just rather put it to the side and ignore it and not consider it. But if you actually look at it and incorporate that into your email, the email will be much stronger and your client will be more likely to do what you want them to do if you address their concerns with taking the steps in advance. So by asking that information and forcing yourself to look at the negative, problematic information, you're much better off and likely to get what you actually want. Sometimes it will cause you to not write the email at all because you realize, this is actually not going to be good for your client, and that's great. If you change your decision to, then you don't want to screw up your relationship with your client by writing that email, right? So that's the first one. Second, what dangerous judgment errors haven't I yet fully considered? So what cognitive biases aren't you taking into account here? There might be a whole bunch of cognitive biases having to do with the clients, with writing the email to the client. So one of the things that I didn't talk about that's really important is called hyperbolic discounting, where we tend to be very short-term oriented. It's our intuition from the Savannah environment. It was not important for us to, let's say if we killed a mammoth, we couldn't freeze the meat, right? That's not something we could do in the Savannah environment. So in the Savannah environment, it was very important for us to be just short-term oriented toward the moment. In the modern environment, well, you're not going to kill a mammoth, but you can put your money in a bank and you can invest in your professional development, how improve your career, improve your organization, the business you're running. So you want to think about the long term. And the client, if you're asking them to do something challenging and burdensome, will probably be short-term oriented and fall into hyperbolic discounting. How you can address that is highlight the clear long-term benefits of whatever project that you want them to take on. And that will help address the client's concerns. So that's the second one. Third, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest you do? So think about that little angel on your shoulder. What would they tell you to do? What would you tell a trusted friend to do in the situation? Step outside of yourself. And you get about 50% of the benefit of this question just by asking it. And you get the other 50% of the benefit by calling your trusted and objective advisor, or if you're a millennial, texting this person. Fourth, how have I addressed all the ways that this could go wrong? So imagine that whatever you're doing has gone completely haywire, completely bonkers, really went wrong. Why did that happen? Imagine all the reasons for why it happened and address them in advance. So for example, maybe your client is in a bad mood because they're working from home and with the COVID-19 and they have their kids crawling all over them, right? So they're in a bad mood, they're really distracted. How can you revise the email to make sure that someone would not interpret it in any negative way? So revise the email, take out any ambiguous interpretations, and draw the client's attention to the most important components of the email. Then, fifth, what would cause you to revise your decision? So what would cause you to change your mind about this email, this email that you're writing to the client? Well, what you can do is you can set a revision point. So let's say you can say, if in a week I haven't heard from my client, I'll give my client a call. That's a clear revision point, and then you can go on and do your other tasks and get back to it in a week when you have it in your calendar. Otherwise, you'll just be waiting for the client, what's going to happen, what's not, being anxious, increasingly anxious about the email, not sure what to do. But if you have a decision point, revision point, that's going to be much better for you going forward. So I talked through these 5 questions in just a couple of minutes, including a case study. And this will save you. I mean, if you lose a client, that's a big, big deal, especially for an important client. So you don't want that. That client probably cost you thousands of hours to acquire and do work for, and many, many thousands of dollars. These 5 questions will help you avoid a lot of disasters going forward if you just apply them. And this is an everyday sort of decision-making strategy. I also go through 8 steps that you want to take on any major decision.
One of the things I like about military decision making when it works well is a thing called mission command, where I tell you my intent, I empower you to make the decisions on the ground because you've got the vision of what I'm trying to get to, and you're the one on the ground. So that ground truth reality really comes through. And I was reading recently General Mattis's book, Secretary Jim Mattis, and he talked about finding the mavericks within your organization, because if you don't, when the maverick outside of your organization gives you a problem, you don't have that person inside internally because you've quelled them, you've pushed them. Heck, you might have made them leave your organization and now they are your adversary. So how does someone deal with the personnel decisions that require you to be uncomfortable and go, this person always challenges me and I want to always be challenged? That's a big hurdle, man.
Oh, that's a big hurdle. I love this question because my own personality, I'm someone who falls into what's called the optimism bias. So the optimism bias is kind of like it sounds. It means that it's something that I tend to be very optimistic about the future. I think the future is positive. I tend to think the world is nice overall, although with the pandemic, I'm not sure. But anyway, the world is nice overall. I feel the world is nice, not think. I feel the world is nice. I feel that the grass is green on the other side of the hill, even though it's often yellow. And I have high expectations for other people and myself, higher than they should be. I tend to be risk blind as opposed to risk averse. And my personality is actually very similar. I'm an entrepreneur. I run a 6-people company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, boutique consulting, coaching, training company in these topics. And in order to start up a small business, it's pretty risky. I mean, half of all small businesses fail within the first 5 years, and about 2/3 fail within 10 years, 3/4 fail within the first 15 years. So entrepreneurs like myself tend to be very optimistic. You have to be in order to start a business.
Now, it's the how it goes, yeah.
Yep, exactly. Now, it's very tempting for me to hire other optimists. It's very pleasant for me to work with other people who reinforce my ideas. You know, I'm the kind of person who has 20 ideas before breakfast, and I think all of them are brilliant. And so it's great for me to work with other people who have those ideas. We reinforce each other's ideas, and it's great. It feels wonderful. But if I only had, the other 5 people in the company, if they were all optimists, we'd have 120 ideas, which would be all trying to implement, running in all different directions in our company. That's bad. That is not a way you run a company, but a number of people try to run their company that way. And that's one of the major reasons, actually, why company crashes down. One of the top 2 reasons why small businesses crash is because they run out of money before they become sufficiently profitable to support themselves. And that happens often because they're not directed enough. They run in too many directions. That's bad. So what I make sure to do is I hire on my team people who have the opposite bias. It's called the pessimism bias. They think the grass is yellow on the other side of the hill, even though it's sometimes green. They tend to be too risk averse, and they tend to not see opportunities. They tend to see threats, and they have low expectations for other people. That's great for me because I give them my 20 ideas, which I think are brilliant, and I hand over control of those ideas. And then they say, well, these are all half-baked potatoes, but these 3 are worth finishing baking. And then they fix the flaws in these ideas because they're terrible at generating new ideas. They see the inherent flaws of each idea, but they're great at evaluating ideas, saying which ones are least bad, and then taking the least bad ones and then fixing the flaws and implementing them effectively. That's great. That's a pessimist strength. So I want to work with these people, even though it feels very uncomfortable. Logically, rationally, intentionally, the intentional system, those are very important people for me to hire. So what you want to do on any team, if order to have that sort of balance that you're talking about, to have that person in the room who is the opposite of many other people in the room, which is so important in order to make good decisions. If you look at teams that have diverse cognitive patterns, optimists, pessimists, and so on, we can talk about that, then they make the best decisions. There's a great book called Wisdom of the Crowds on this topic. So you want to have people who have diverse thinking patterns on your team. Valuing that, making sure that you have diverse people with different thinking patterns and that they're given a voice, they're protected, they're acknowledged as the awesome devil's advocates that they are. Those are the kinds of people you want to make sure to have on your team. And that really helps you. Having that pattern, orienting toward cognitive diversity, that really helps you make good decisions going forward.
That leads into a question that will be our closing question from Mary in Weber City, Virginia, who asks, what about people rewriting their gut reaction to implement your techniques if they're handicapped with OCD?
Yes. OCD is a challenging experience. So OCD is something I suffer from a little bit myself. It's obsessive compulsive disorder. What you want to do is, before you jump into a decision-making process, you want to decide how much information you're going to look for. So you want to look only for important information. People with OCD tend to look for way too much information before making a decision. It's their kind of pattern of going into the decision. You want to make sure to commit to looking only for this information. This is how much information I'm going to look for. I'm not going to look for more information than this. And so you stop yourself when you found the relevant information on these topics, and you want to make sure to not go through the process more than once. So those are the kind of things that people with OCD, that's what they want to do. And I talk about that. There's cognitive bias called information bias, where some people fall into that. That's one of our personality patterns, who look for too much information that's irrelevant for making the decision. So you want to cut that off. You want to decide in advance what the relevant information is, and then only look for that information.
Terrific.
That's a fantastic laydown, man. I love it. What do you think, John?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Terrific. Again, today our guest was Gleb Tsipursky. His book that we talked about was Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. His website is disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Great URL. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And folks can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, GLEBTSIPURSKY. If you have any questions about anything you've heard on this show, please connect with me and ask me.
And I'll put all of that stuff in the show notes. If you missed any of it, I can't spell Gleb. So if you struggle at all, look us up on Twitter. Gleb's there. Gleb is on all social media platforms, but hit him up on LinkedIn for sure. I don't got anything else, John, do you?
No, I think that's a great way to close. And everybody, take a look at disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Go buy the books, and we'll look forward to your new one. And maybe you'll join us again to promote your new book.
Sure, happy to.
Terrific. Thank you. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, everyone.